does the movement to combat climate change have to do with reversing mass incarceration here in the United States? With me to talk about the issue is James Kilgore. He's a research scholar at the University of Illinois' Center for African Studies. He's the author of 3 novels, all of which were drafted during his 6.5 years he served in prison. He also has a new book coming out next year, which is called Understanding and Ending Mass Incarceration, a primer, and you can read his latest piece on Truthout, which is entitled What the Movement Against Mass Incarceration Can Learn from the Struggle for Climate Justice. Hi, James. Welcome to Truthout Interviews.
Hello, Ted. How are you doing?
I'm doing fine. You know, Naomi Klein's new book, This Changes Everything, Capitalism versus the Climate, was one of Truthout's progressive picks for the week when it was released. You reference Klein in your latest piece on Truthout, and you talk about the movement and what the movement to end mass incarceration can learn from folks that are trying to combat climate change. Can you talk a little bit about the parallels between these two movements and what they can learn from each other?
Well, what prompted me to write this piece was the fact that in the run-up to the UN Climate Summit and the mass demonstration that took place alongside of that, the Bureau of Justice Statistics in the U.S. released the incarceration figures for 2013. And for the first time since 2009, these figures went up. And there had been a lot of jubilation for the previous 3 years amongst activists around the issue of mass incarceration because the numbers had been going down. So I began to think, well, why are these numbers going up, and what's the real issue here? And as I reflected both on what Naomi Klein wrote and on some of the history of the climate change movement, I thought that there was things that we could learn from some of the successes and failures of that movement. And there was 3 things that came to mind. The first is that this is really a systemic problem. It's not simply a few bad policies or a few laws, but as the climate change people have found out, tweaking recycling or carbon trading schemes or self-regulation or endless rhetoric about sustainable development is not the same as substantive change, and it's substantive change that's required. I think the same thing is true with mass incarceration.
Yeah, I mean, with Klein's book, she's basically saying we can't recycle our way out of this problem, making these small little changes. And it's the same with mass incarceration in a way. We can't just release a few hundred or a few thousand prisoners and think, well, we're making progress.
Well, I think we can release people and make progress, but we can't end there. We have to get to the root of the problem. And I think a second part of the lessons to be learned from the climate change movement is the fact that sometimes success is equated with, as they might put it, getting inside the big tent. You know, being present in UN summits and in Geneva, Paris, Rio de Janeiro, wherever the huge meetings of corporations and heads of governments are taking place, that social movements sometimes feel once they're in those meetings that somehow that equates with success. And I think that people in the climate justice struggle have learned that that's not an equivalent of success, and that a massive social movement is needed in order to make the kind of systemic changes that are going to be required to reverse climate change. I would argue we need a similar kind of process in terms of ending mass incarceration.
Right, it comes from the ground up. You were in prison for 6.5 years because of your involvement with the Symbionese Liberation Army. And you were in state and federal prisons in California. There's been a lot of media coverage about private prisons in the United States and how they're at the forefront of the so-called prison industrial complex. Now, you were inside the system, as I said, both state and federal. What can you tell us about some of the issues or even myths that are being reported right now?
Well, I think one of the things about mass incarceration is that it's a state-driven project. Only about 9% of the people who are in prison in the U.S. right now are in prisons that are either owned or operated by the private prison corporations. So although I'm certainly not a fan of private prison corporations, I think they're a pretty evil sort of entity making money off of locking people up and making more money out of locking up more people for longer periods of time. At the same time, they're in some ways a soft target because it's so easy for us to put an anti-corporate agenda onto the mass incarceration movement and focus our energies on there. And I think that it's a good target, but the primary thrust is the fact that it's state prison systems like the in California, like systems in Texas, New York, across the country that are really the cutting edge of mass incarceration. And if we actually look at the kinds of solitary confinement institutions, the special housing units, the places like Pelican Bay Shoe, where we've seen a number of hunger strikes in recent years, these are all state-run prisons. So the main target, really, in terms of mass incarceration, is the state departments and the corporations and businesses that support them in growing the prison and jail system across this country. So an excessive focus on private prisons may be a diversion that lets the real culprits off the hook.
Well, you talked about a systemic problem, and a lot of times it starts with the laws, because the laws sort of frame who goes to jail and who doesn't, and who they target and who they don't, and who gets a pass and who gets locked up for minor infractions. And when private prisons started, I remember having an argument with a friend of mine, or at least when private prisons started to gain some traction. And I said, well, what is the goal of a capitalist enterprise? Is to increase your profits and to start to grow your business year after year. I said, if the laws are written in such a way that allows that market to grow, then what you're going to see is more people being locked up. And we were just going back and forth about this. He didn't want to acknowledge the capitalist sort of ideology underpinning the prison system and the way in which the laws were written. But it seems like with your work that you're doing, not only your book that's going to be coming out next year, but also what you've written up on Truthout. And I've interviewed a number of people who have talked about prisons here on Truthout interviews. So it's sort of a recurring theme that there is this. It starts systemically, that the laws themselves are written in such a way that it creates the market conditions for growth.
I think that's absolutely true. And as far as mass incarceration goes, I think there's two sets of laws that are crucial. The first is the whole set of laws around drugs, which led to the war on drugs, which then led to a whole very much racialized and class-based enforcement of drug laws, which has put massive numbers of African Americans disproportionately incarcerated in the system. So we now have about 40% of the people in prison are African American, despite the fact that they're less than 15% of the population nationally. And then secondly, in more recent times, we've had the harsh anti-immigration laws, which have seen the proportion of Latinos within the state and federal prison system skyrocketing since the turn of the century. So both of those have been absolutely essential in terms of providing the basis to expand the prison system, and also providing an impetus for all of those who benefit from the expansion of prison system to grow their profits and their political power. Because I think it's important to realize that there are corporations that make money off of prisons. Those who build, those who design, those who supply prisons make huge amounts of money off this. But there's also a whole layer of political and politicians and government employees whose livelihood and political power is tied to the growth of the prisons and jails across this country. So there's a political agenda as well as a profit-making agenda. And the political agenda has largely been about controlling the marginalized sectors of the working class, which are predominantly people of color in urban areas.
The population, the demographics, if you will, of the prison population is overwhelmingly black and brown skinned folks, mostly men. Now, one of the things we were going back and forth on email prior to this interview was you wanted to talk a little bit about the notion of prisoners as a kind of slave labor.
Well, I think, Michelle Alexander, for example, has called this the new Jim Crow, and I've also added the immigration component to call it the new Operation Wetback, which was a big deportation effort in the 1950s in the U.S. But I think the notion that, for example, the predominant thing that's taking place in prisons across this country is a chain of sweatshops which are producing profit for transnational corporations, I think is very incorrect. What's really happening is that people are being warehoused in prisons. And as I put it before, what I've seen on prison yards is people trying to exercise and find other ways to deal with the massive boredom that they face because they're being given no programs, they're being given few educational and employment opportunities, and they're basically given nothing to do, nothing to help them plan their future. So they're almost being set up for failure. They're being set up to be put back into prisons. So I think while in the South, in some agricultural-based prisons, and in a few other places, we do have employees of corporations, contracts where prisons contract with private corporations. It's a very small number of people, somewhere on the order of 60,000 people who are working on contracts throughout the prison system. So I think what's much more important to look at is who are these people, where are they coming from, and how are we going to reconstruct the communities that they come from? Because like climate change, we are finding that this is a bottom-up process in the sense of the impact is hitting communities at the bottom. If we look at climate change, we see that it's island nations, that it's African farmers who are losing their livelihood because of deforestation and drought. It's the million people who have been displaced by Haifan in the Philippines. It's people who are impacted by Katrina and Sandy in the U.S., and indigenous Native American people who are facing tar sands, pipelines, and the like on their land. These people of color at the bottom are those who are critically impacted by mass incarceration and by climate change. And these are people who necessarily, I think, have to play leadership roles in any movement to achieve systemic change, whether we're talking about climate justice or whether we're talking about mass incarceration.
Well, James, we're going to leave it there. I want to thank you for being on Truthout Interviews.
Thank you very much, Ted. It's been a pleasure talking to you.
You can read James Kilgore's latest piece on Truthout. It's called What the Movement Against Mass Incarceration Can Learn from the Struggle for Climate Justice. And thanks for watching Truthout Interviews. I'm Ted Asregadoo. See you next time.